For about as long as I can remember, I've wanted to make a fighting game. I've had countless ideas over the years, but none of them led to anything, and it wasn't until recently that I understood why. Thing is, fighting games are a dime a dozen. There are hundreds of solid fighters out there, but outside of the major titles that are played at EVO every year, most of those releases fall into obscurity. So without a ton of resources and a gigantic marketing budget at your disposal, it feels damn near impossible for an indie studio to get a fighting game off the ground. Why would anybody play your game over Street Fighter, Tekken, or Mortal Kombat? A lot of developers choose to hook players in by turning their game into a joke, like Fight of Gods, a game that lets Santa Claus reenact the Passion of the Christ. But even when a game has ridiculous characters and an outlandish setting that nobody's ever seen before, fighting games still have a major problem. They all look the same. That's because Street Fighter II established the formula for fighting games back in the early 90s, and 32 years later, most fighting games still use that game as a template. Two fighters facing each other seen from the side, health bars at the top of the screen with a timer in the middle, normal attacks, special attacks, hold back to block. Most fighting games start with that and then add or alter mechanics to try and make something different. Trying to make another game in that style sounds like a good way to get buried under the thousands of games that come out every year. As much as I like playing Street Fighter II clones, I'm not as interested in making that kind of game as I used to be. So I set out to design a different kind of fighting game, something that had never been done before. To do that, I started looking at non-traditional, unorthodox fighting games that didn't appear to follow Street Fighter II's formula. After months and months of research, I came to the conclusion that, technically, fighting games don't exist. It wasn't easy escaping from that mental institution, let me tell you. But now that I'm out, the people need to know. Here's the problem. No matter what kind of definition you can come up with for what a fighting game is, there's a game out there that'll contradict it. The genre is just impossible to define, and not for a lack of trying either. Based on what I've seen, the majority of people feel that a fighting game has to revolve around melee attacks. Fair enough, right? But imagine a fight between Ryu and Ken where both players spend the entire match throwing fireballs. Regardless of the other attack options the players could have used, that one match played out like a shooting game. But that's an isolated incident. It's not a good representation of Street Fighter's gameplay. So what about characters who use guns for their normal attacks like Noel Vermillion from BlazBlue? Still not convinced? That's alright, I wouldn't be either. So allow me to introduce you to shmup fighters like Maiden and Spell and Cinco no Rondo, two games that are a cross between fighting games and shooters. Those two games belong to an obscure subgenre based on a gimmick though. The majority of fighting games do in fact revolve around melee attacks. All I'm saying is that melee combat isn't a requirement to be considered a fighting game. So then people try to define fighting games as being a one-on-one duel between two players, completely ignoring platform fighters like Rushdown Revolt and Roof Rampage, and also arena fighters like Gundam Versus and Dissidia Final Fantasy. Point being, fighting games aren't limited to just two players either. Fighting games don't even have to have fighting in them. Just look at sports-based fighting games like Lethal League, Windjammers, and the Tekken Ball mode in Tekken 8. Or how about One-on-One Government, a straight-up basketball game that plays like a fighting game. Actually, now that I think about it, the NBA Street Series had ultra combos in the form of game breakers, a mechanic that later found its way into other EA Sports big titles. And you can't have a conversation about sports and fighting without mentioning hockey. The insanity doesn't stop there either. Look at Super Puzzle Fighter, a game that was designed from the beginning to be a cross between a fighter and a puzzler. How is that game any different from playing Tetris head-to-head? And if a puzzle game can be a fighting game, why not a rhythm game? That was the theory behind God of Rock anyway, which is just the next iteration of the battle mode from Guitar Hero. And that was just a progression of what rhythm games in the arcades have always been. See what I mean? Outside of the Street Fighter II formula, the fighting game genre doesn't have any definable mechanics. A fighting game might as well just be any game that can be played competitively. That got me thinking about games that could be considered fighting games even if they weren't intended to be, like the lightsaber duels in the Jedi Knight series, or the PvP mode in Dark Souls or Elden Ring. Aside from the RPG mechanics, what's different about two players fighting in that game and an arena fighter? The answer is nothing. Some people might argue that fighting games have to be in third person, and those people have never played Bushido Blade. I mean, For Honor has been accepted and embraced as a fighting game, and aren't the Chivalry series and Mordhau pretty much the same thing, just in first person? So if a fighting game can also be a shooter, and if they can feature teams of players, and if they can be in first person, that would mean that Rainbow Six Siege could be considered a fighting game. It's frustrating, because it's like, can we at least limit the genre to action games? And you know, we used to be able to do that, but not anymore, thanks to a game called Your Only Move is Hustle. If you've never heard of I'm Hustlin, let me break it down for you. Some hyperdimensional super genius created a turn-based fighting game, 100% turn-based. And then, after the match, you can watch a replay of the fight in real time, which plays out exactly like a typical 2D fighter. I'm Hustlin wasn't the first turn-based fighting game. The name itself is derived from tabletop card game Yomi, which is why the name had to be changed, but everybody still calls it I'm Hustlin. Other examples of tabletop fighting games include the successfully kickstarted BattleCon and the Milton Bradley Street Fighter II board game from 1994. Then there's Tori Bash, a physics-based fighter that pauses every 10 frames to allow you to control the individual joints of your character. Even though I'm Hustlin wasn't the first, it's undeniably the best implementation of the concept of a turn-based fighting game. If you had told me about it before I had seen it and played it, I would have said it couldn't be done. This game is impossible. It defies the laws of nature. It's a literal game changer. It's also a massive pain in my ass. Because if fighting games can also be turn-based, then a fighting game really is just any game that can be played competitively. And that includes chess, not to be confused with Checkmate Showdown, a chess game that turns into a traditional fighter when a high-ranking piece tries to take another. I feel a little better knowing that I'm not the only one who's confused about what a fighting game is. Just look at the fighting tag on Steam. There's no way to predict what games get that tag. It's all over the place. So either the fighting game genre has hundreds of different subgenres that have yet to be labeled, or the genre itself doesn't exist. Because if the definition of a fighter is just a game where you have to defeat your opponent, that means a fighting game is also two speedrunners competing for the fastest completion time. If you think that sounds ridiculous, I agree with you. But the fact of the matter is, we clearly don't have enough information to determine what is and isn't a fighting game. Traditional fighting games aren't the problem, because again, they all look the same. You can identify a Street Fighter II clone just by looking at it. That's why I've started a movement to call that specific style of game a versus game, to distinguish them from games that don't follow that template. But to define fighting games in more general terms, I think as an industry, we need to spend some more time in the lab. I had planned on making this video a lot longer, but after looking at the list of unorthodox fighting games I had compiled, I realized I was just repeating the same thing over and over again, and I'm pretty sure I've made my point. As much as I'd like to insert a coin and continue, I've hit a wall, so I'm gonna have to revisit this subject another time. For now, I'm gonna turn it over to you guys in the audience, in hopes that somebody out there can see anything that might be hiding in my blind spots. What is a fighting game? If you have a definition, or even a better way to find a definition, please let me know, because I'm not going to be able to keep these orderlies off me for much longer. Anyway, I gotta get ready for the next battle, because my next opponent's a cheap-ass, input-reading, fireball spamming son of a Blanca main. That's coming up next time. If you don't want to miss it, you know the drill. Subscribe or die.